Hello, my name is Craig Childs and I'm pastor of the Kirk in Greensboro, North Carolina. And in this series of devotions on sufferings, it's time for us to talk about some of the good purposes that God brings about to suffering. That's not something we often think about. Suffering doesn't seem like it brings about any good, and yet we are promised in Romans 8:28 that it will. All things, God causes all things to work together for good, for those who love God and are called according to His purposes. What are the kind of five, or what are some of the good things that God does? And I usually talk about five. Talk about the 5 Ds, being deliverance and discipline and development and deployment and destiny. And I'd like to talk about deliverance today. And what I mean by that is that sometimes the Lord orchestrates suffering into the life of a non-believer in order to bring them to the end of themselves and to deliver them from the bondage of darkness and bring them to Christ. Probably the classic case for that is going to be in Luke 15. And in Luke 15 you have 3 parables of entities that are lost: the lost sheep, the lost coin, and finally the lost boy. And while some people think that the parable is about a believer, it is the Father who kind of lets us know that it is a parable of a lost boy. He said, "This son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found." And so the story, as it goes in the parable, is there is this rebellious son who does not want to live under the authority of his father. He kind of wants to run his own life, be the captain of his own ship. And so he asks for his stuff and he gets it. And the parable says that he goes down to the foreign land and he wastes all of his inheritance on loose living. And when he is destitute, suffering comes upon him. There's a famine in the land, and he ends up with a job that no Jew would take, and that is feeding the pigs. And it gets worse. He even begins to look at the slop of the pigs and say, you know, a little salt, pepper, Tabasco sauce, that might not be too bad. And God brings him in the pigsty to the end of himself. And the scriptures, verse 17, says that he comes to a senses. He sees himself as he really is, rebellious, arrogant, and now broken and dependent. And he repents, and he goes back to the Father's house, and his Father receives him with grace and mercy. The truth is that sometimes God puts suffering in our life to bring us to the end of ourselves. A friend of mine in my first church named Don, his testimony is this, that his life was grand. I mean, he believed in God. He didn't have a relationship with Christ, but he believed in God. He had a great marriage. He had beautiful kids, had a gorgeous house at the foot of a mountain, wonderful business, a stocked bank account. And then his life experienced calamity. And he will tell you, he says, calamity is good because calamity brought me to Christ. And his wife walked in and said she was done with him. She was done with the kids. She was done with their life. And she was done with their world. And his world collapsed. And it just crumbled. And Don was one who could always fix something, and he couldn't fix this. And Don went to the very bottom of the barrel, and for the first time he had a desperateness, first time he had a brokenness. Someone shared to him about Christ, and he literally fell into the Father's arms and embraced Christ. And he will tell you that if it had not been for suffering, had not been for calamity, he would never have been able to give up his self-reliance, his self-sufficiency, the facade of having it all together. And so sometimes God decides to bring suffering into our life, to bring us to the end of ourselves. And so the truth is, God has purposes. Sometimes He brings it to deliver us from the bondage of darkness. Sometimes He brings suffering that we might be disciplined even after we are believers. Sometimes He brings suffering on a life that we might be developed for the role in the war of wars that He is going to fight through us, and He knows what's coming down the road. Sometimes He brings suffering on a life to deploy us, to take us where He is going to use us. And sometimes He brings suffering in our life to get us ready for our destiny. The great hope that comes from suffering is knowing that God knows what He's doing. And even in the issue of deliverance, bringing us to Himself, some of us are so stubborn and so difficult and so full of ourselves, to be honest, that we will not come to know Christ unless calamity comes into our midst. So, thank you very much.